Well, thank you so much, Rashmi, and thank you, Inakshi, and both your organizations for making this possible. What an amazing audience you have there is this evening, and I'm really delighted to be with you. I'm also, I have to say, pretty intimidated seeing colleagues, friends, and others in the audience, and indeed having Prerna as the moderator for this evening. So I also, wanted to say just how much I wish I could be with you in a room in Mumbai. But of course, that's not possible at the moment. So I'm particularly grateful to the organizers of this evening, both for inviting me, but also for making this occasion possible. So, is nationalism necessary? It seems impudent almost to raise such a question in the context of the Indian nation, a country where the emergence of nationalism was vital in breaking free of colonial domination. And no doubt Indian nationalism did represent an awesome movement of self-making, a redescription of a vast subcontinent and its varied peoples living under different forms of rule, as forming a collective, solidary people, as forming a nation entitled to rule over itself. And yet so powerful in its own telling was this nationalism that triumphed in 1947. So fully were our leaders invested in the myth-making about the kind of pluralist nation it could create, that we can continue with our impudence and observe that advocates of India's official ideology of nationalism willfully fail to acknowledge the contours of their own history, in particular, the depth of the country's divisions, religious and in other respects. That distortion, in turn, obscured the implications of the history they were making. As in many other new nations around the world, a history replete with internal complexities, conflicts, and tensions was airbrushed to create the origin myth, expedient choices that primed the pump for conflicts to come. Tagore was among those who sensed this danger clearly and early. In 1925, amidst rising religious communal tensions across India and Gandhi's efforts to assuage them and build national unity through means such as spinning the charkha, Tagore aired a thumping critique of the Mahatma's efforts to inculcate nationalist beliefs. Alluding to the collapse of Gandhi's first campaign of nationalist mobilization, the non-cooperation movement of 1920-21, Tagore reminded his countrymen of, as he put it, and I quote, the tremendous exultation lately produced by the imaginary easy prospect of Hindu-Muslim unity. Such efforts to engineer national unity, spectacular in the moment, had invariably left behind what Tagore called, and I quote, a desert track of demoralization. But the fact is that history's nuances, wherever suppressed, ignored, or brushed away, have a tendency of recrudescing, then and obviously now. Take, for instance, the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia into the Balkans bloodbath of the 1990s. Or take the United States since the rise of Trump in 2016, as post-racial illusions felt the whiplash revenge of white nationalism. Or take Afghanistan this very year, as the efforts to create a non-sectarian national identity have foundered in the face of religious zealotry. Why would we Indians be immune? And now, of course, the official ideology of the post-1947 state, call it secular nationalism if you like, has given way to another variant of nationalism, a nationalism that anchors Indian identity in religion, in a politicized version of Hindu beliefs. This new variant is equally enamored of its own story about Indian nationalism, its own claim to being the sole and authentic vehicle of Indianness, and if anything, is even less attentive to its own history and context. This mythic invention is again a common feature of all nationalisms. Think of Brexit Britain, imagining it can reinvent its imperial past as a free-trading global Britain. Think of Syria's Assad, willing to devastate his own country in order to build what he calls, and I quote, a healthier and more homogeneous society. Think of Hungary's Viktor Orban, willing to risk the benefits of EU membership in order to prosecute his anti-immigrant policies and preserve Hungary's supposed racial purity. Scratch a nationalist movement deep enough, and you tend to find such desire for racial purity at root. In April 1946, and could I have slide 1, please, here? In April 1946, as Jewish refugees from the Holocaust streamed into Palestine, the 39-year-old Hannah Arendt wrote emphatically to Gershom Scholem, another of the 20th century's leading German Jewish thinkers. If we could have slide, yeah, great, thank you. In April 46, Hannah Arendt wrote to Gershom Scholem, and I quote, "There is a very real danger that a consistent nationalist has no other choice but to become a racist. The metamorphosis of a people into a racial horde is an ever-present danger in our times. And you'll surely agree with me that a racial horde has precious little to do with renewal, but it has a lot to do with ruin and destruction." That Scholem nevertheless insisted on the necessity for a Jewish nation state in Palestine, even as Zionists were using every means, including terror, to achieve that end, is in itself a searing reflection of the power of nationalism. When a people facing existential threat have to call for more nationalism, we're forced to recognize just how insufficient the other isms or remedies at hand are. Nationalism has always been a vital tool in dismantling domination by empires and colonial powers. But that's just nationalism getting started. Nationalism has been a powerful antidote to bien-pensant liberalism, which peddles abstract rights and perfectly designed constitutions while ignoring cultural traditions and preferences. Nationalism is an antidote as well to the utopianism of Marxism and socialism, with their illusions of international class solidarities and their blindness to the loyalty bonds of local community. And nationalism is an antidote to rarefied cosmopolitanism, which, as the jibe goes, can talk a lot about man in general, but has little to say about humans in all their particularity. But let's also consider more positively what nationalism is, instead of what it counters. Nationalism promises human association based on genuine bonds of collective belonging. If it can't quite deliver the actual kinship bonds promised by the Latin root of the word, nasci, or common birth, it nevertheless offers the sense of belonging to an invented, or what social scientists would call a fictive family. Nationalism brings individuals together into groups and gives them a sense of being able collectively to act for themselves. It promises to make the alien, impersonal world of modern political institutions, the opaque workings of the global economy, for instance, more intimate, familiar, and legible. It promises to infuse such institutions with the culture, the values, the preferences of a particular people, and thereby to bring them back under control. To use the 18th century political thinker Edmund Burke's phrase, nationalism puts back in charge the little platoons. It promises to root us in neighborhood and community, to care about those around us, to contribute to and benefit from practices of common welfare, to sustain such things as a national health service and the social provisioning of a society. It offers a return to the inner circles of empathy. And nationalism operates, it must be said, with a refreshing candor relative to its ideological competitors like socialism or liberalism. We must put ourselves first, nationalism says, look after our own. After all, if not we, who? And that is not the only way that nationalism is transparent. It's also upfront about the means and ways in which it operates, about the ploys it uses to construct a sense of a national we, the fictions of history, the accentuations of commonalities, and the suppression of differences. Nationalism happily makes its own reality. And as a result, nationalism is, analytically speaking at least, an easy target for academics to dismantle. It's not that much sweat to reveal its artifices and manipulations, its uses and abuses of history, its persistence as a sedimented fiction. Nationalism may indeed be a cognitive error, an ideology, that is, an incorrect or mystified belief about how the world actually is. But gleefully pointing that out doesn't curb its power to produce massive effects. In the Darwinian struggle of political ideas, nationalism has shown remarkable adaptive capacities, ever evolving, continuing to grip people's imaginations and motivate them to remake the world, and all along quite impervious to clinical critique from erudite scholars. This evening, I'll discuss the historical emergence of the concept of nationalism in the wake of the French Revolution and the German counter-understandings against it. And I'll trace some of the more illuminating theories that have been used to make sense of the phenomenon. I'll consider also some of the inherent ambiguities in this very modern political term, which lends it both its power, but also its dangers. And as I go along, I'll ask how the Indian case fits with this history and theory, a case which for long was something of a unique outlier one that resisted European definitions of the nation in order to formulate its own version. Yet, as Indian nationalism settled into being a state form, is it conforming to more conventional types of nationalism? So let me turn to the history of the concept. Though nationalism claims to describe an ancient impulse, the concept itself is a pretty modern phenomenon, at least in terms of its political utility. Concepts of justice or liberty date back millennia, but it's only at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries that the concept of nationalism first appears as a pivot of political argument. While later nationalisms would be promulgated by and manipulated by elites, the early forms emerged from an acute critique of an elite, the French aristocracy. In a famous 1789 work by a French clergyman turned revolutionary theorist and politician, the Abbé Sieyès, a work entitled What is the Third Estate?, Sieyès depicts the nobility of birth, the bewigged, stockinged marquises, dukes, and counts who consider themselves a superior breed apart, as parasites, extracting wealth from the men and women who work the land and spending it on vacuous cosmopolitan luxuries. And Sieyès argued that the productive classes were the authentic French. They alone constituted the true nation. The nation then existed not just separately, but in opposition to the state, which had fallen into the hands of a decadent, corrupt monarchy and its courtiers. Sieyès called that productive class, Sieyès' call to that productive class to claim its rights and expunge the extractive upper classes or estates who were milking their privileges. And that call became the rallying cry of the French Revolution. And with that revolution, we see the first moment when the concept of the nation asserts a claim over the state and becomes a mobilizing force in politics. But notice that Sieyès defines the nation in productive, economic, indeed functional terms, not at all in cultural, ethnic, or religious ones. In fact, although the French may share a language and religion, what identified the members of the nation were not those markers, but whether they were parasitic upon the wealth of the nation or whether they contributed to it. As the initial revolution of 1789 morphed into the more radical regimes of the 1790s, and especially as France embarked on the revolutionary wars in the Napoleonic era, the French saw themselves as charged with disseminating the values of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and what were also recognizably the universal values of the Enlightenment. And this claim to embody universalist political values became central to France's identity as a nation in the form of the Republican model, where membership is supposedly defined by embracing the political and civic values of the Republic, and is not restricted by ethnic or cultural traits. This French emancipatory idea as a political project to secure revolutionary and Enlightenment values would inspire subsequent nationalist struggles, starting with the Greek War of Independence, begun exactly 200 years ago this year, followed by the constitutional revolutions of Latin America. Events in France also enthused Indians like Ram Mohan Roy and many others across the world who over the next century and a half struggled to free themselves from imperial rule. This French idea of, as they call themselves, la grande nation, the exceptional and universal nation, was intended to foreground nationalism as a liberating force. It enabled a conflation between the pursuit of national interest and a mission to promote universal values, a conflation that later also became part of America's national identity, living on into our times in such projects as nation building and democracy promotion through war and invasion. Returning back to the French case, as the French sought to spread their message across Europe through military conquest, other Europeans perceived their efforts as domination, not emancipation. It provoked a massive intellectual counter-reaction emanating from German philosophers and thinkers, from Herder and Fichte being the most prominent. These thinkers developed a critique of the universal values and cosmopolitanism of the Enlightenment, which they saw as abstract and overly rationalist, a hollowing out of human identity. For them, what makes us human are our particular local affiliations and belongings, embodied in language, culture, and traditions. A counter-conception of nationalism emerged, in opposition to the French view. This view, in its initial and best formulations, was protective, seeking to preserve and conserve the diversity of ways of life and culture against the critique of abstract reason. Thus, nationalism enters and comes to permeate modern political discourse in this foundationally split form, with contrasting meanings imparted to it by French and German understandings. A definition, on the one hand, in terms of universalist political values, as against, on the other hand, the search for cultural commonalities that set groups apart, and which later would extend to ethnic and racial commonalities and differences. Recall here Arendt's warning. To put it differently, against France, with its aspiration to a universal republic and a conception of civilization in principle open to all, we have the German idea, with its conception of Kultur and the history of more authoritarian government. Much of the academic discussion since has turned around this opposition, this founding opposition, seeking to clarify and assess the differences between what gets in the academic discourse variously called civic as against ethnic nationalism, or Western as against Eastern nationalism. And according to preference, one is embraced and the other rejected. Indeed, the subsequent practical enacted history of nationalism up until today exemplifies the divided potentialities of the concept as an emancipatory force as well as a catastrophically destructive one. The compelling feature of nationalism in both forms is its clear language of identity and identification, of who belongs in the nation and who does not. Nationalism draws a sharp boundary line between friend and enemy, between us and them. The friend-enemy distinction, of course, being the most fundamental distinction in politics, as the German political philosopher Carl Schmitt famously argued in 1927 against the background of the Nazis rising to power. Yet the content of the we is inherently changeable. The criteria of membership can start by being open, centered on universal political values accessible to all. But these values can then be abruptly tied more restrictively to religion or ethnicity. For example, French Republican values profess to be open to all, but a politician like Marine Le Pen can insist that in fact they are essentially Christian. American values are supposed to be accessible to all immigrants, but a Trump can imply that such values are epitomized by white Americans, not Latinos. Indian tolerance, supposedly part of the general public culture of all Indians, gets defined more narrowly by Hindu nationalists as a quality intrinsic to Hinduism. Every nationalism, whether of the good or bad kind, is vulnerable to contingent political redefinition. This movable quality of nationalism's referent, who is the nation, is exactly what gives the language of nationalism its power. And in this sense, it's a fundamentally political concept, a ready instrument to absorb the contingent preferences and aspirations of a group when it comes to matters of identity, and to seek to impose a we. The logic of this kind of identity politics, in its search for authenticity, is driven to ever more restrictive criteria. There are no fixed principles or constraints to determining such criteria. How they are decided will always be hostage to the prevailing balance of political opinions and forces. Think of Germany in the 1930s. German language or race no longer sufficed to justify one's belonging. Birth, race, and blood were added, thereby excluding Jews, Roma, and others. Recall the South African legislation of 1950, one of the pillars of apartheid, which introduced strict racial classifications and created new hierarchies of citizenship. Or India's 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act legislation, which added religion as a criteria of the path to seek citizenship, of the right to seek citizenship. In such ways, nationalism can use constitutional means to drastically redefine the nation through what appear to be innocuous administrative changes in routine legislation. To recognize this is to see that nationalism possesses an inherent volatility. It is permanently vulnerable to capture by those who can heighten the we-them distinction, demagogues who mobilize and weaponize this kind of language, leaders who have skills to blame them for our troubles. In the last century or so, most of the success of nationalist movements came in three historical waves. And just as a reminder of those, a kind of history 101 for all of you. The first wave was after the First World War. This signaled the breakdown of proletarian internationalism as the working men of Europe took up arms against one another. By the end of the war, the major multi-ethnic empires of Europe, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, had collapsed. What followed was a stampede to create new nations, a carve-up of the map of Europe that left as many dissatisfied as content and set the stage for the rise of National Socialism. The second great wave followed the end of the Second World War. It left Europe destroyed by nationalism. And even as Europe divided into socialist and capitalist camps, there was determination across that continent that nationalism had to be tamed. But all over Europe's Asian and African empires, anti-colonial nationalisms were on the rise, beginning with India and the other South Asian states of Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, and as well as Indonesia. A wave of new nationalisms was set in motion that extended well into the 1960s and beyond, leading to a huge expansion in the numbers of nation states. And a third wave followed, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991, leading to the most recent wave of nationalist urges and taking form in the creation of new states, new nation states. When such waves are studied from a scholarly distance, what comes into focus is an important corrective to conventional popular thinking about nationalism. Many of us like to think of nationalism as signaling a people taking charge of their own destiny, as a deployment of political will, a form of political voluntarism, nations shaping their own future. While no doubt that willed ambition may long have coursed throughout individual nations, it is only at particular historical conjunctures, international conjunctures, that nationalism has been efficacious, that it has been able to realize its aspirations. In fact, standing back, we can see that the great eras of nationalism and nation-state formation have occurred when the international order is in the throes of disruption and crisis, the end of empires, wars, and their aftermath, when states have been destroyed or their ownership is contested. Such ruptural moments have created conditions, openings, for claims to nationalism to be recognized in the form of nation states. Seen thus, it's not surprising that some of the major mobilizations of Indian nationalism coincided with moments of international crisis. Gandhi's non-cooperation movement took shape in the wake of the First World War and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, while his 1942 Quit India movement was directly prompted by the Second World War. And the timing of India's own independence in 1947 was clearly a function of the war's aftermath. Ernest Gellner, a brilliant contrarian thinker, was one of those scholars examining structural conditions that make nationalism possible. In his view, a nation is not a pre-existing community that precedes and lays claim to a state. Rather, modern states create nations by imposing a common culture on their members. For a modern state to function and survive under industrial conditions, it has to create a high degree of cultural homogeneity in its population, beginning with a common language imparted through an educational system, in order to produce the mobile labor force that industrialism requires. And could I have slide 2 here, please? As Gellner puts it in one of his characteristically provocative formulations, and I quote here, nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist. Another intriguing Gellner argument: whatever might be the content of particular nationalism, the common function of nationalisms was to serve as a vehicle for aspiring elites in their ambition to replace existing ones. In other words, nationalist conflicts are conflicts of social mobility, when aspiring elites or groups felt blocked by an established ancien regime, who hold control either over economic or cultural capital. At such moments, they turn to the language of nationalism to try to usurp them. It's an insight that resonates with and generalizes the 18th century Abbé Sieyès' mobilization of the idea of the nation to depose what he described as the parasitic French Ancien Regime. In some ways, the Indian case doesn't fit neatly with Gellner's analysis. For instance, contra one of his central theses, Indian nationalism emerged in a largely agrarian society and in opposition to a colonial state. But Gellner's idea of nationalism as a social mobility mechanism chimes with one of the more enduringly interesting studies of Indian nationalism by the historian Anil Seal. Back in the 1960s, around the same time that Gellner was hammering out his ideas on nationalism, Seal argued that Indian nationalism was a vehicle less for high-minded ideals than for the material ambitions of a specific class, aspiring professional elites, lawyers and administrators, products of the newly created British educational systems, who wanted to secure their own interests. At one go, he deflated the view of Indian nationalism as a noble and selfless pursuit of freedom and other principles, and saw it rather as an extended Jobs for the Boys campaign. Within some quarters in India, Seal was repaid for his argument with fury and sneers. Yet, if we ignore such insights, we will also fail to grasp important parallels with the present. with, for instance, the recent rise of Hindu nationalism, where once again a rising elite is pressing for space to pursue its own interests. For another illuminating perspective on nationalism, and one more attuned than Gellner to the non-European experience, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of Benedict Anderson, a historian of Southeast Asia, who happens to be, or to have been rather, the brother of Perry Anderson. Just imagine breakfast table talk as they were growing up. Like Gellner, Anderson saw nationalism as a distinctively modern form of community making, a form of collectivity made possible only by the presence of modern technologies, many of them associated with colonial rule. Map making, statistical counting of populations, cheap printing technologies that made newspapers and the paraphernalia of nationalism, pamphlets, posters, novels, available to the masses. And also the creation of lineages and histories centered on monuments and museums. Such tools, Anderson argued, were taken up by educated colonial elites and deployed to establish new types of connection across long distances between people who previously had no face-to-face connection, but who came to see themselves as part of a common people, who became fascinated, indeed even obsessed, as they visualized their massed numbers distributed on maps, and came to venerate their ancestry in monuments, in works of history, and in museums. They became what Anderson famously called imagined communities, believing themselves to be singular and distinct. But, and this was Anderson's kicker point, in fact, they were part of the mass production of new communities across the globe. Nationalisms, Anderson argued, were modular in form, constructed from the same toolkit. They were mirror images that emulated one another. Like IKEA cabinets, you can choose and change the knobs, but the structure is pretty much the same. And here was another analysis of nationalism that infuriated Indians and historians of Indian nationalism, because it portrayed Indian nationalism to be a derivative form. To me, the strength of a Gellner or Anderson is their unwillingness to take nationalism at face value, to highlight the material and other conditions that enable this way of imagining and ordering a state to be invented. But that is also their limitation. They do not take the ideas of nationalism seriously. Invented, imagined, fictive, it may well be. But the content of nationalism, the ideas and reasons for action these ideas give to people, do matter. At the level of ideas, some early 20th century Indians were drawn to the classical European models of nationalism, embodied in the examples of elite-led unification that you saw in Italy and Germany in the late 19th century, steered by leaders like Mazzini and Garibaldi, who rallied the masses, and Bismarck, who worked the corridors of power, all willing their nations into being. Upper caste Indian intellectuals in particular were attracted by the German emphasis on a singular ethnic culture in search of its rightful geographical space. This was the strain of religious and ethnic nationalism that V.D. Savarkar systematized through his conception of Hindutva, and which was given dogmatic form in his successor M.S. Golwalkar's specification of Indian nationalism through the 5 elements of race, language, religion, culture, and territory. This was perhaps the nearest that Indian nationalism came to being a derivative, modular form, emulative of Western models. It drew, indeed, on the toolkit of nationalism, using population censuses, maps, monuments, graphics, to create an imagined community that looked recognizably like a nation, according to Western definitions. Recessive in post-independence India until the 1990s, this variant has now become dominant. And the rise of this strain would have merely confirmed the fears of a different set of mid-20th century Indian intellectuals, who also looked to Europe, but to its more recent interwar experiences, and for warning rather than inspiration. Men like Ambedkar and Jinnah, who belonged to minority communities, but who were steeped in liberal ideas, looked back in the early 1940s at interwar Europe of the 1930s and at the fate of minorities there. They were horrified at how nation states with mixed populations failed entirely to protect minorities. Ambedkar, and can we here have slide number 3, please? Ambedkar, in his remarkable 1940 book, Arguing the Case for Pakistan, reminded other Indian nationalists who hoped to stifle the demand for Pakistan that, and I read you the quote on the screen, the right of nationalism to freedom from an aggressive foreign imperialism and the right of a minority to freedom from an aggressive majority's nationalism are not two different things. Nor does the former stand on a more sacred footing than the latter. They are merely two aspects of the struggle for freedom, and as such equal in their moral import. While Jinnah would work towards the creation of a separate territorial nation state for the subcontinent's Muslims, Ambedkar, who had considered for a while the idea of a separate Dalistan to secure the interests of Dalits, would ultimately shift his position. He moved away from favoring smaller, homogeneous territorial states as the best way of securing the rights of minorities, to a belief that such rights could be better protected in large-scale federal states with robust constitutional orders and procedures. In making this shift, Ambedkar crossed over the bridge to join perhaps the most innovative line of thinking about Indian nationalism, one that did not settle on the defined markers or criteria, race, language, religion, culture, and territory, to define the nation. The advocates of this third position, which included men like Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, and others, differed bitterly on many issues. But together they enlarged how Indians, how we, can think about the nation and nationalism. Profoundly convinced of the unity of India, they conceived of that unity with a complexity and nuance absent in European conceptions of nationalism, as I've tried to show elsewhere. That complexity and nuance in turn placed a greater burden on the need for political skills to sustain such a conception. Those skills were in increasingly short supply after the passing of the generation who brought India to independence. A generation who, I'd argue, did not do enough to inculcate and share those skills beyond a narrow elite circle, with consequences that we're dealing with today. Lately, when I step back to consider the turns and twists of nationalism in the past 100 years, I'm struck again by the insights of Hannah Arendt. Arendt's deep political understanding of nationalism enabled her to see it as more than a functional necessity for industrial progress, or simply as the product of cheap printing presses and state censuses. I turn to her often these days because I also see India in the 21st century as following a path that Arendt outlined in her great if flawed work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's much to disagree with in that book. Her conflation, a kind of Cold War conflation of Nazism and communism into a single radically new regime form, for instance. But she was quite right in seeing how the state can drift from being an instrument of law to becoming an instrument of the nation. The nation is exclusively and excludingly defined. Arendt viscerally understood the necessity of the nation state as a modern political invention that provides safety to its members, defined as citizens. She knew what she was talking about as a refugee from Nazism. But she also recognized how the nation state was susceptible to being taken over by the expansive, aggressive ideology of nationalism. And here, could we have slide 4, please? How it could be transformed from an instrument for the security and welfare of all its citizens into a weapon in the service of the nation become racial or religious horde, to recall her phrase. How it could be turned against its own members and those of other states. I'll read you this quote from Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. She writes, "The state inherited as its supreme function the protection of all inhabitants of its territory, no matter what their nationality, and was supposed to act as a supreme legal institution. The tragedy of the nation state was that the people's rising national consciousness interfered with these functions. In the name of the will of the people, the state was forced to recognize only nationals as citizens, to grant full civil and political rights only to those who belong to the national community by right of origin and fact of birth." In Arendt's warning is a caution against believing one can pick and choose which elements of nationalism one prefers, a nationalism à la carte, if you like. The openness of nationalism to the will of the people, to those who claim to speak in its name, makes it difficult to control and predict. I'd argue that nationalism's present-day resurgence within both authoritarian and democratic states poses for us practical, ethical, and existential problems. Practical in that government policies motivated by nationalism disrupt global economic interdependencies. Global interdependencies that may be moderated, but can't be put back in the bottle. And problems that are existential in that the central challenge facing human species survival, the challenge of dealing with the effects of human choices and activities upon the Earth's environment, have little likelihood of being solved through the frame of nationalism. Indeed, the immediate threat of COVID-19 has brought home to almost every household across the world, perhaps even more urgently than the slow burn of climate change, just how ecologically connected we are. How insouciant of national borders are some of the major threats we face. And problems that are ethical, in that nationalism rejects the universalist ambitions associated with liberalism, with its respect for the individual and their rights, and instead gives priority to the cultural self-regard of a particular collective, diminishing the worth placed on other different forms of life that are increasingly in close and tense encounter with one another. And those problems, practical, ethical, existential, have consequences that can't be covered up indefinitely by the nicotine patch of nationalism. For instance, in the autumn of 2020, Trump ran aground when his efforts to blame the China virus for his inability to control the pandemic fell flat. Practical consequences in the economy and on people's lives drowned out the white supremacist dog whistling. Similarly, now in Brazil, Bolsonaro's bravado and blazoning of his nationalist credentials, even as some 600,000 of his countrymen have died through lack of any coherent and effective public health policy in response to the virus, are turning people against him. In such recent setbacks for nationalist demagogues, one can find both new reason to hope and fresh relevance in that sharp analysis Tagore made nearly a century ago in 1925. And could I have the 5th slide, please? That mass-produced nationalism, the hype whipped up by Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, was, Tagore argued, as subject as any business bubble to cycles of boom and bust. Human nature has its elasticity, Tagore wrote, and in the name of urgency, it can be forced towards a particular direction far beyond its normal and wholesome limits. But the rebound is sure to follow. And so what's left in countries around the world when nationalist mythology and the promises made in its name fail to translate into improvements in the lives of the citizens who bought into it? What's left, more often than not, are those desert tracks, as Tagore called them, and leading towards profound disillusionment. But to say nationalism comes in waves is also to accept that what recedes doesn't fully disappear. As such, we must reluctantly conclude that nationalism is necessary. Speaking as it does to fundamental human desires for safety, agency, and connection, it's by now a central part of the ideological economy of the modern world. It will wax and it will wane, but it will not vanish, even as its critics trivialize its attractions, dismissing it through terms like seduction or delusion. As such, nationalism inspires for the aware citizen an attendant set of necessities. To wean ourselves as best we can from myths and to understand, explore, contextualize, historicize the concept better than we currently do in India. Understand it and ultimately contest it, as has been characteristic for decades of India's best thinking about nationalism. A contestation that has made our nationalism richer, more nuanced, more Indian, and our own, if you will. Because that's really the essential, or here's rather the essential truth about nationalism, one whose consequences we're living today in India. In its fluidity, its lack of fixity, it can never really be trusted. As its inherent logic pushes towards extremist exclusion, its potential for destruction, and indeed for self-destruction, cannot ever be fully controlled. Thank you.